Hey guys, tonight we step back into a world where survival is never guaranteed, and the very air around you could carry a threat you can't even see. You trudge through streets that smell faintly of smoke, mud, and the unfamiliar tang of decay, while people around you whisper fearful tales of neighbors suddenly falling ill, sometimes within hours. The wind carries a chill that seeps through your bones, and the sun seems dimmer somehow, as if the world itself knows that something unseen is at work. You probably won't survive this if you don't pay attention, or maybe that's just the comforting exaggeration storytellers always add, but either way, the story is riveting. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, comment down below with your location and local time. It's always interesting to see where in the world you're joining me from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into a time when disease is a mysterious, invisible adversary, and communities have no knowledge of germs, bacteria, or viruses. The first plagues in human history arrive quietly, creeping across trade routes, carried by humans and animals alike. Historians still argue whether the very first outbreaks were truly widespread epidemics or a series of localized diseases that just happened to coincide, but either way, they leave their mark. You hear the first rumors from distant towns. Messengers speak of people collapsing in the streets, of villages suddenly emptied, and of the strange patterns of illness that defy explanation. The early records, often scrawled in shaky handwriting, describe swollen lymph nodes, fevers, vomiting, and sudden death. It's a world of fear, uncertainty, and adaptation, where human resilience is constantly tested. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a small settlement. Smoke rises from chimneys, but the smell is different this morning, heavier, more acrid. Cattle are restless in the fields, and the birds have gone unusually silent. You feel an unease that is hard to place, but the older villagers whisper that the sickness is coming. They speak of it in hushed tones, referring to it as the Great Pestilence, a name both ominous and vague. People begin to alter their routines subtly, avoiding contact with neighbors, cleaning utensils more diligently, and sometimes resorting to superstitious practices, like burning herbs in doorways. Some scholars suggest these early preventive measures may have slowed transmission, while others believe the chaos of panic nullified any benefits. You wander through the village market, noticing the absence of children playing, and the streets, once bustling with barter and gossip, are quieter. Merchants still display their goods, but the interactions are cautious. Everyone is alert, watching for signs of illness in both humans and animals. You overhear discussions of faraway towns where entire families have disappeared overnight, leaving homes abandoned and fields untended. The fear is contagious. Even the bravest among you feel an almost magnetic pull toward avoidance, an instinctive response to the invisible enemy. This is where you begin to understand the psychological toll of epidemics. Stress, anxiety, and dread pervade every conversation, every glance. Historians still argue whether the panic itself caused more harm than the disease in certain early outbreaks, as families abandoned sick members and social cohesion frayed. At night, the village takes on a ghostly quality. The torchlight flickers across mud walls, casting dancing shadows, and the sounds of distant coughing or the clatter of hurried footsteps keep you alert. You notice families keeping their windows closed, sometimes using rags or herbs to block out the air, believing that the sickness floats invisibly, ready to invade the lungs. Some try to purify water with boiling or filtering methods, while others resort to superstitions, wearing amulets or sprinkling salt around thresholds. It's a delicate balance of fear, ritual, and the faint hope that these efforts will protect them. You can't help but notice the irony. Sometimes the most desperate measures are completely ineffective, yet they provide a psychological shield that helps people face each day. The first plagues also bring stories of inexplicable survival. A farmer who sleeps near his animals but does not contract illness, a midwife who tends dozens of sick children yet remains healthy, and the healer who seems cursed to suffer while others thrive. These stories ripple through villages, creating a mix of awe, fear, and superstition. People start questioning why some live while others die, attributing survival to luck, divine favor, or obscure rituals. Today, we might look at these accounts and guess at immunity or mere chance, but at the time, the explanations were part of the cultural fabric. Historians still argue whether the observed patterns were biological, social, or entirely coincidental, but either way, they shape behavior and survival strategies in tangible ways. You trudge along a narrow alley, noticing the piles of refuse that even without plague would be concerning. Now, however, every piece of rotting vegetable, every discarded piece of leather, seems like a potential threat. Villagers whisper about vermin, convinced that rats and fleas are agents of doom, without realizing they are correct in their instincts. These animals move freely through the town, and while people blame invisible curses or the wrath of gods, the real culprits are the tiny carriers no one can see. The interplay of observation, misunderstanding, and partial truth is fascinating. Even without microscopes, humans start to make connections. Dense living conditions, close contact with animals, and unhygienic practices seem to correspond with increased deaths. Some of these conclusions are rudimentary, but they form the seed of what will later become epidemiology. You find yourself imagining the first formal responses to these outbreaks. Town elders and leaders meet in dimly lit halls, debating what should be done. Some suggest isolating the sick in the outskirts, while others call for prayers and processions to appease divine forces. Quarantine, in its earliest form, emerges here, a concept based on observation, fear, and cautious experimentation. Lazarettos and makeshift hospitals spring up near city gates, often staffed by volunteers willing to risk their lives. These efforts vary in success, and historians still argue whether early isolation slowed disease or merely displaced it. Regardless, these are your first glimpses of human ingenuity, the blend of fear, morality, and necessity that defines survival in these early epidemics. By now, you begin to notice how the plague reshapes daily life. Market days are less frequent, communal meals are rare, and even children learn early to avoid unnecessary contact. Communication relies heavily on messengers and signals, often carrying their own risk of infection. People adapt, sometimes inventively, herbs in pockets, masks of cloth soaked in vinegar, or rudimentary sanitation measures in homes. You recognize that the human spirit, when pressed to the brink, finds ways to preserve itself even amid chaos and ignorance. Fringe tidbits appear. Some households hang flowers or incense to cleanse the air, while others wear jewelry or stones believed to protect them. These rituals may seem quaint or irrational today, but they play a crucial role in morale and mental survival. By evening, the village settles into a strange rhythm. Caution replaces casual interaction, and even routine tasks feel weighted with the knowledge of risk. You notice families speaking in hushed tones about neighbors who have vanished or succumbed overnight. Fear is omnipresent, but life continues, adapted to accommodate this new normal. This is your introduction to the human story behind statistics, a lesson that will echo throughout the coming sections. Resilience, superstition, ingenuity, and fear intertwine, shaping how communities face their deadliest challenges. You take a deep breath, feeling the cool night air and listening to distant murmurs, and realize that even in the darkest periods, humanity finds ways to cope, survive, and occasionally even thrive. You wake to a morning damp with mist, the kind that clings to your cloak and chills your skin despite the day's slow rise of the sun. Outside, the village seems almost asleep, though the underlying tension is palpable. Rats scuttle along the alleyways and the marketplace, their tiny claws scratching against cobblestones, oblivious to the fear humans project onto them. Fleas hitch rides on their furry backs, invisible but lethal companions, carriers of the very plagues you've been hearing whispers about. You probably won't see them coming, but the moment they arrive in your home, on your clothing, or on your livestock, they set in motion a chain of events beyond anyone's control. People call them omens, pests, or even demons, but in reality, they are the agents of contagion. Historians still argue whether humans could have identified their role earlier, or whether a combination of ignorance and luck delayed recognition long enough for epidemics to escalate. You follow the narrow street leading to the marketplace, where merchants set out their wares with a caution born of necessity. Flies hover over open meat, vegetables pile high in baskets, and the occasional rat darts in and out, largely unnoticed by those focused on their own survival. Every basket, every bundle, is a potential vessel for disease, though at the time no one can know. People begin noticing patterns. A particular household falls ill after buying from a certain stall, or a visitor from a neighboring town seems to bring misfortune. Observant villagers adjust, cleaning more rigorously, burning bedding, and sometimes abandoning animals. These early acts, however partial and inconsistent, represent humanity's first stabs at behavioral epidemiology. Inside one of the homes, you notice the care with which families try to separate themselves from rodents. Grain is stored in containers raised above the floor, and small fires are sometimes built to keep vermin at bay. Children are discouraged from playing in corners where rats congregate, though you know full well that no method is foolproof. The connection between rodents, fleas, and disease is there in practice, if not in understanding. Some households even attempt fumigation with herbs or vinegar, relying on folk knowledge passed down through generations. Fringe tidbits abound: sage burned at doorways, powdered snake skins scattered across thresholds, or charms placed near beds. While scientifically ineffective, these measures provide a psychological layer of defense, and mental comfort is surprisingly powerful when confronting invisible killers. Walking through the village, you encounter a group of young men tasked with cleaning the streets. They sweep refuse into carts, which are then dumped at designated pits, hoping to reduce the rodent population. Yet, these very actions sometimes spread fleas further, carrying bacteria that the villagers can neither see nor comprehend. You overhear debates. Some argue that these efforts are helping, others claim they stir up disease instead. Historians still argue whether urban cleanliness initiatives during early epidemics truly reduced mortality or merely shifted it. Either way, there is a clear recognition. The environment itself, the very streets and alleys, plays a critical role in survival. You pause to observe a rat dart across the threshold of a bakery, disappearing into a heap of flour sacks. Flour, grains, and other stored foods are the backbone of village sustenance, yet they also attract rodents. Some families elevate their food storage, others tie sacks closed, and a few rely solely on prayers that the vermin stay away. You reflect on how subtly behavior changes. Doors closed when they were once left open, floors swept more meticulously, cats kept close as allies. Even small shifts like these can mean the difference between life and death, though people at the time understand them only through trial, error, and superstition. Among the villagers, you notice whispered comparisons between homes that remain healthy and those that fall victim early. Why does the family on the hill remain untouched, they ask? Did they anger the gods less? Did they simply keep their animals outside? In these conversations, a proto-understanding of vectors begins to emerge. Observation, intuition, and pattern recognition form the rudimentary backbone of what will later become scientific epidemiology. Quirky historical notes surface. In some regions, people tied red ribbons to doors to indicate sickness, while in others, black marks warned of recent deaths. The signs were as much practical as psychological, creating a shared, though flawed, system of communication. You move toward a crowded well, where villagers gather to fetch water despite the invisible threat. Some refuse to share buckets, fearing contamination. Others, more trusting or desperate, ignore advice. Social dynamics, human behavior, and necessity collide in small but meaningful ways. Even the act of fetching water is now laden with risk assessment. You observe older women teaching children to use separate cups or utensils, though not everyone complies. Historians still argue whether such early behavioral adjustments significantly slowed disease spread or if they were minor factors overshadowed by the sheer virulence of the pathogens. By midday, the village has settled into a tense rhythm. Rats are more noticeable, children are quieter, and conversation is cautious. Merchants bring goods from neighboring towns, inadvertently carrying more than wares. Fleas, as silent passengers, find their way into homes, infecting animals and sometimes humans. Some households rely heavily on cats and dogs to hunt rodents, believing in their protective power. Fringe wisdom persists: powdered garlic in corners, bell ringing at doors, and charms worn to deter both rodents and disease. Mental rituals and animal allies intermingle with early hygiene measures, forming a hybrid system of prevention that is fragile but meaningful. You overhear a conversation about a merchant's journey from a distant port, describing how entire neighborhoods were emptied by plague. Each story is a cautionary tale. Humans moving freely can carry devastation inadvertently. The villagers now see rats and fleas as a natural extension of human travel. They move, you move, and so does danger. Lessons are learned slowly, with observation at the center. Even small errors, such as leaving food out overnight or allowing animals to nest indoors, are recognized as risks. These patterns, emerging from human observation and fear, are surprisingly sophisticated for a time with no scientific framework. As evening approaches, you notice how the sun's angle casts long shadows over empty streets and rooftops. Families retreat indoors, shutting windows and barricading doors. Cats patrol the corners, seemingly aware of unseen threats. You recall earlier rumors about rats carrying pestilence, and now, seeing them in the moonlight, it all feels eerily tangible. The village is caught between routine and fear, between superstition and observation. Humans have begun learning to coexist with the agents of disease in practical, if imperfect, ways. Finally, you settle by a small fire, observing that while fear is pervasive, knowledge, however fragmentary, is forming. People adapt their behaviors based on what they see, survive, and remember. Each day is a careful negotiation with the environment, with rodents, and with human neighbors. Oddly, there is a rhythm to this vigilance, daily routines punctuated by caution, rituals, and observation. Even in the absence of scientific certainty, survival is increasingly a product of attentiveness, instinct, and communal memory. These early lessons, small and often unrecognized, lay the groundwork for centuries of evolving understanding. The city streets stretch before you, narrow and twisting, lined with buildings so close together that sunlight barely reaches the ground. You trudge along, noticing the odor, part smoke, part refuse, part something faintly metallic that hints at decay. This is a city during a plague outbreak, and the difference from a rural village is stark. Here, disease travels faster, fed by crowded homes, bustling markets, and the constant movement of people. You see laundry hanging across alleyways, but it does little to hide the grime. Children peek from doorways, and even they move cautiously, aware of the danger in every cough or sudden stumble. Urban life, once full of color and sound, has become a delicate dance of avoidance and vigilance. You pass a bakery where loaves sit unsold, untouched by cautious buyers. The streets themselves, once vibrant, now resemble slow-moving rivers of fear. Rats scuttle among trash heaps, as if conducting their own secret commerce. Fleas ride along unnoticed, tiny but devastatingly effective carriers of plague. You probably won't see them, but their presence dictates human behavior in subtle ways. Historians still argue whether urban design or sheer population density was more responsible for the intensity of plague outbreaks, but either way, the streets themselves become both obstacle and informant. Survival depends as much on observation as it does on luck. At one corner, a small group gathers near a water fountain. Some wash their hands, a practice learned through careful observation, while others drink directly, oblivious to potential contamination. You notice a baker moving quickly, transferring flour from sacks to trays, unaware that his own apron has likely brushed against a rodent nest. Every interaction carries risk. The city operates under an unspoken understanding that proximity equals danger. People speak in whispers about neighborhoods that have gone eerily quiet, about entire families suddenly missing. Fringe practices emerge, hanging herbs at doorways, burning incense in homes, and chalk markings on gates to indicate sickness or recent deaths. Such rituals are a blend of practical caution and superstition, providing both psychological relief and partial protection. You wander past a row of taverns, noticing their reduced patronage. Once lively hubs, they now seem desolate, the air thick with the smell of stale ale and fear. Patrons peek in, rarely sitting together, conscious of proximity. The innkeeper sweeps constantly, tossing ashes and scraps to discourage vermin. You hear stories of plague doctors venturing into taverns, their beaked masks a terrifying sight to those unaccustomed. Some believe the mask itself holds magic, others know little of its intent. Historians still debate how effective early protective clothing was, and whether fear of the unknown sometimes overshadowed practical outcomes. Yet, even symbolic measures have value, providing a sense of agency in a time of uncertainty. The streets are lined with discarded belongings, mattresses, blankets, and utensils left behind by families fleeing or succumbing to illness. You observe a man carrying a basket of loaves to a family in hiding, careful to avoid close contact. Quarantine in the urban setting is chaotic. Some districts are cordoned off with rudimentary barriers, while others resist entirely, fearing loss of trade or livelihood. You notice how commerce and fear collide. Merchants want to sell, yet risk the wrath of the disease. Fringe survival tips circulate. Sprinkle vinegar on floors, carry cloves in pockets, and keep cats inside to hunt rats. Some methods are surprisingly effective, others purely ritualistic, but all contribute to a collective sense of control. You pass by a narrow alley where children play cautiously, using sticks to nudge rats away from homes. The elders watch silently, knowing that even small interactions could have deadly consequences. The alleys themselves are both protection and trap. Tight spaces allow observation but also limit escape if infection appears. You notice the improvisation: raised platforms for grain, small fires to repel pests, and cloth hung over windows to reduce air movement. Every small measure counts, yet every choice carries trade-offs. Historians still debate whether urban planning or social behavior had more impact on plague survival, but it's clear that a combination of both was necessary. Alongside the alley, you encounter a healer attending to a family member. His tools are simple: bandages, herbs, and a rudimentary thermometer, but he moves with practiced care. Despite limited understanding of contagion, he intuitively separates patients, cleans his instruments, and advises isolation. Families watch, learning by example. You notice that even in the most crowded districts, behavioral adjustments occur. Distancing, hygiene, and observations subtly alter outcomes. Fringe tidbits appear. An old woman swears that ringing bells in every doorway keeps plague spirits away, while a child ties garlic to his belt. These actions, while folkloric, demonstrate human adaptability and the psychological strategies that complement practical measures. By evening, the city seems quieter, yet more ominous. Shadows stretch long over cobblestones, and smoke from chimneys mingles with the cool night air. The smell of decay is present but less immediate, replaced by a pervasive caution. You recall the chaos of the streets, the scattered belongings, and the cautious routines that now govern urban life. People move with purpose, avoiding eye contact and unnecessary conversation. The city becomes a study in tension, adaptation, and survival. Observation, improvisation, and fear dictate behavior, forming a framework of resilience that is as psychological as it is practical. You wander toward the market square, noticing the remnants of once bustling stalls. Some merchants still offer goods from outside the city, while others have shuttered entirely. You observe families avoiding shared water sources, washing produce meticulously, and relying on cats and dogs to keep vermin away. Each behavior represents a negotiated compromise between survival, practicality, and tradition. Historians still argue whether some of these strategies were more effective than others, but their collective effect is evident. Survival is possible, but only with constant vigilance. Finally, as night falls, the city assumes a muted rhythm. Torches flicker against stone walls, doors are closed, and families huddle together, sharing knowledge and strategies learned from observation, rumor, and experience. Rats still move in the shadows, and fleas remain invisible yet deadly. Quirky rituals, like sprinkling herbs and tying charms, continue alongside practical measures, reflecting the blend of superstition, ingenuity, and psychological coping that defines plague survival. The streets may be quiet, but the human struggle continues. A quiet, vigilant dance with unseen forces, played out in narrow alleys and dimly lit squares. The chill in the early morning air carries whispers of fear, rumors that spread faster than any messenger could manage. You trudge past rows of houses, noticing how people speak in hushed tones about neighbors who have fallen ill overnight. Some claim it's a curse, others murmur of divine punishment, and still others suspect foul play, but all agree on one thing: survival is tenuous, and the city's streets have become treacherous. You probably wouldn't last a week if you wandered without care, but careful observation and learned rituals can extend your chances. So you move cautiously, noting behaviors that may help or hinder. Historians still argue whether superstition or practical caution had a stronger effect on survival, but the interplay between belief and action is undeniable. You pass by a small chapel, its doors slightly ajar. Inside, a few people kneel, clutching rosaries and murmuring prayers, seeking protection against the unseen enemy. Religious rituals offer comfort, but they also reflect human attempts to understand and control the uncontrollable. Candle smoke mingles with incense, creating a heavy haze that masks some of the city's odor, though not the tension. You notice that even children are taught to pray at intervals, an early form of psychological coping, blending faith and daily routine. Fringe tidbits emerge. Some believe carrying a saint's relic can ward off sickness, while others sprinkle holy water around doorways. These rituals, while spiritually motivated, serve as both comfort and a subtle attempt at control. As you continue along the narrow alleyways, you observe the practical side of these rituals. Townspeople avoid certain streets rumored to be plague-laden, creating unofficial pathways and shortcuts. Merchants and travelers adapt by limiting their routes, aware that proximity to the sick or to unsanitary conditions could be fatal. Even the most mundane actions, fetching water, buying bread, or visiting a neighbor, require assessment and caution. You notice how the social fabric stretches and twists under pressure. Some communities support one another, while others collapse into isolation and fear. Historians still debate whether fear-driven segregation helped contain outbreaks or exacerbated suffering, but there's no doubt it shaped daily life. You stop by a market stall, noting the wary glances exchanged between buyer and seller. Produce is handled minimally, coins are quickly exchanged, and a practiced distance is maintained. Some merchants hang herbs above their stalls, claiming the scents purify the air, while others rely on charms or amulets. The line between practical caution and superstition is thin and constantly shifting. You notice an old woman handing a sachet of dried herbs to a child, insisting it will keep the sickness away. Quirky though it seems, these acts demonstrate human ingenuity. When invisible threats loom, psychological reassurance can be as vital as physical measures. In a side street, you encounter a healer mixing a bitter concoction of herbs and vinegar. Patients wait in the open air, seated on benches spaced as far apart as possible. You watch the healer move from one to another, dabbing rags here, applying poultices there, oblivious to the danger of his own exposure. The tools are rudimentary: wooden spoons, cloth bandages, and jars of powders, yet they represent centuries of accumulated experience. Historians still argue whether any of these early remedies had measurable effect, but the process of care itself contributes to survival, instilling routines and practices that reduce reckless exposure. You notice families barricading their homes with makeshift materials, boards over doors, cloth over windows, and even small fires to fumigate spaces. Children are instructed to remain indoors, while adults fetch supplies cautiously, minimizing contact with neighbors. There's an improvisational elegance to these measures, not fully understood, but partially effective, blending superstition, observation, and necessity. Fringe stories abound, sprinkling ash around thresholds, hanging onions to purify the air, or tying red cloth to indicate a sick household. Some of these rituals persist because they work, others because they comfort. Either way, they create a fragile framework of control in a city teetering on the edge of chaos. By afternoon, the streets hum with a muted vigilance. People walk briskly, exchanges are terse, and open spaces are rare. You see merchants cleaning surfaces obsessively, children avoiding contact with stray animals, and families whispering about those who fell ill the previous night. The urban environment itself is both a battlefield and a classroom. Observation, adaptation, and ritual shape every interaction. You recall earlier accounts of folk practices, noting how they intermingle with emerging hygienic routines. Historians still debate whether the rituals were symbolic or partially protective, but the psychological and behavioral impact is clear. As evening falls, torches flicker along the cobblestones, casting long, shifting shadows. You notice quiet neighborhoods, families huddled indoors, and the occasional figure moving stealthily through the streets. Rats are active in the corners, and fleas remain a hidden threat, yet humans adapt continuously. You remember the prayers, the herbs, the small interventions that blend practical measures with superstition. Life persists, slow and cautious, with observation as your guide. Even amid fear, humans find ways to negotiate risk, balancing ritual, ingenuity, and vigilance. Survival is never guaranteed, but it is possible, and each step taken with care increases your chances. The morning light filters through narrow windows, dust motes drifting lazily in the beams, and you step into a city still trembling from the previous night's quiet unease. Quarantine is no longer a suggestion. It has become a survival imperative. Some districts are cordoned off with wooden barriers, gates reinforced, and guards posted to prevent movement in or out. Lazarettos, rudimentary isolation hospitals, have been established at the edges of the city, staffed by volunteers and the curious few willing to risk their own lives. You probably wouldn't last an hour here without learning these boundaries, yet for those who adhere, the chance of survival increases. Historians still argue whether these early quarantines actually slowed disease spread or merely displaced infection to less monitored areas, but the principle of isolation begins to emerge as a crucial tool. You move past the first lazaretto, where patients sit outside on benches, their faces pale, eyes hollow, murmuring in confusion or despair. Physicians, if that is what you can call them, approach with cautious determination, herbs and poultices in hand, their masked faces hidden behind the iconic beaked respirators. You notice their movements are deliberate, measured, and strangely ritualized. Even if their understanding of disease is incomplete, the methods are rooted in observation, avoiding direct contact when possible, burning aromatic substances, and keeping the sick separate from the healthy. Fringe tales circulate of beaked doctors whose costumes themselves supposedly repel disease spirits. While mostly symbolic, these measures reinforce a psychological buffer that encourages both caution and adherence to isolation. The concept of quarantine extends beyond the lazaretto. Families are instructed to remain indoors if a member shows any signs of illness, and supplies are often delivered by intermediaries who themselves take precautions. You observe food and water being left outside doors, coins exchanged indirectly, and messages written and hung for communication. The city's rhythm shifts, normal commerce slows, travel is restricted, and social life is constrained to minimal interactions. Historians still debate how much early quarantine measures impacted mortality, but there's little doubt they shape behavior profoundly, teaching communities to negotiate risk consciously. Along the perimeter of a cordoned district, you notice a guard inspecting travelers, questioning their origins, and observing for any visible signs of sickness. Merchants bristle at delays but comply, understanding that movement restrictions are intertwined with survival. Fringe practices abound. Some travelers carry sachets of herbs or wear charms, claiming protection during passage. You notice how superstition and practical observation coexist. A belief in the supernatural provides psychological comfort, while the act of avoiding crowded areas has a tangible, if limited, protective effect. Inside households, you notice subtle but critical behavioral shifts. Sick family members are separated into one room, windows opened for ventilation, and bedding burned or boiled if possible. Children are kept away from adults showing even minor symptoms. Everyone adjusts daily routines to minimize contact and exposure, a mixture of fear-driven caution and learned survival strategies. You see how even small practices, washing hands in running water, sweeping floors more meticulously, or using vinegar to wipe surfaces, can reduce contact with fleas, dirt, and infected materials. Historians still argue whether such methods were widely effective or sporadic, yet they are consistently observed across multiple outbreaks, suggesting early collective wisdom. In the markets and streets beyond, similar adjustments occur. Merchants handle goods minimally, buyers linger briefly, and even casual greetings are replaced by nods or gestures from a distance. The urban environment becomes a complex choreography of avoidance, observation, and adaptation. You notice that the psychological aspect of quarantine is as important as the physical. Maintaining distance reassures people, reduces panic, and encourages adherence to other precautionary behaviors. Fringe rituals, like sprinkling herbs in doorways or marking quarantined houses, persist alongside these behavioral adjustments, reinforcing both social order and individual safety. By mid-afternoon, the Lazaretto's courtyard is a hub of controlled activity. Caregivers move between patients with cautious precision, herbs fumigate the air, and families deliver food or messages indirectly. You observe how patterns of human behavior, spacing, cleanliness, and careful observation interact with the constraints of quarantine. Even those skeptical of these measures follow them, partly out of fear, partly from learned effectiveness. Historians still debate whether the rituals, the observation, or sheer isolation had the most effect on controlling outbreaks, but the blending of all three creates a multi-layered survival strategy. As evening descends, city streets empty further. Families retreat into isolation, merchants secure their goods, and guards remain vigilant at checkpoints. Even the quietest alleys bear subtle signs of activity. A window ajar to provide ventilation, a basket of bread left outside a quarantined door, or herbs dangling to repel both rodents and illness. Survival now depends on a delicate balance, careful adherence to isolation, observation of symptoms, and psychological coping through ritual. You realize how these early methods, primitive, inconsistent, and partially misunderstood, form the foundation of public health strategies that will evolve centuries later. You step back, noticing the overall rhythm of the city under quarantine. Tension and stillness punctuated by small movements, each calculated and deliberate. Fear, observation, and superstition intertwine, guiding behavior and shaping survival. Even amid uncertainty, humans find ways to enforce boundaries, protect themselves and others, and maintain a fragile sense of order. Each day in this environment is a lesson in vigilance, adaptation, and resilience, a delicate negotiation between fear, observation, and ingenuity that will echo throughout history. You wake to the low hum of activity outside, the city still trembling from the previous night's quiet unease. Among the streets and alleyways, you notice figures moving cautiously. Healers, physicians, and barber surgeons going about their perilous work. You probably wouldn't last a day in their shoes, yet these individuals form the backbone of early medical response during plague outbreaks. Armed with rudimentary knowledge, herbs, and tools, they navigate a landscape of fear, superstition, and desperation. Historians still argue whether their methods truly reduced mortality, but their presence provides both practical aid and psychological reassurance to the afflicted. Walking alongside a busy thoroughfare, you notice the healer's routine, observing patients, applying poultices, and offering advice, all while keeping a wary eye on their surroundings. Their equipment is minimal: wooden bowls, linen bandages, jars of powdered herbs, and occasionally a pair of tongs or scissors. These tools are simple, but they reflect centuries of accumulated practice. Fringe practices emerge. Some physicians carry fragrant pomanders or sprinkle vinegar over wounds, convinced these measures purify both air and body. You observe that even partial protection, combined with attention and care, can sometimes make the difference between life and death. In homes across the city, barber surgeons, men who double as hair cutters and rudimentary medical practitioners, move with purpose. They bleed patients using lancets, apply leeches, and extract teeth, their techniques often harsh by modern standards but intended to balance bodily humors according to contemporary medical theory. Families watch and learn, trying to emulate protective measures, keeping distance, cleaning tools, and following procedural order. Historians still debate how effective these practices were scientifically, yet they undeniably influenced survival behavior, shaping early public health understanding. You pause outside a small apothecary, jars lining the shelves with mysterious powders, dried herbs, and colored tinctures. People gather outside, hoping for a remedy or comfort. Some purchase garlic, cloves, or exotic herbs thought to repel sickness, while others seek advice on poultices, teas, or aromatic fumigations. You notice that even in these rudimentary systems, observation drives adaptation. Those who see patterns of recovery may replicate techniques, while others discard methods that fail. Fringe remedies abound: spider webs for fever, crushed roots to draw out evil, or animal fats applied to wounds. But within the mix of superstition and practicality lies survival strategy. As the sun climbs, you follow a physician into a courtyard where several patients sit apart, waiting for treatment. He moves deliberately, assessing their symptoms: swollen lymph nodes, pallor, fevers, and visible signs of fatigue. Families observe, sometimes assisting by holding herbs, damp cloths, or water. Even without a scientific understanding of bacteria or infection, these caregivers act on observation, separating patients, attending to hygiene as best they can, and enforcing rudimentary isolation. Historians still argue whether any particular technique saved lives, but collectively, these actions reduce chaos and improve chances of survival. In the alleys, you notice healer networks forming organically. Information flows between families, neighborhoods, and practitioners: which herbs are available, which rituals seem to provide relief, and which households are safest to visit. Knowledge spreads slowly, often mixed with superstition, yet it is essential for urban survival. Fringe practices continue alongside observation: hanging charms, sprinkling herbs, and applying scented oils or powders. While largely symbolic, these rituals instill confidence, maintain social cohesion, and guide behavior, subtly influencing outcomes even without scientific grounding. By midday, you observe the delicate balance between healer interventions and community adaptation. Families modify routines based on advice, distance themselves from the sick, and engage in small but meaningful acts of hygiene. The presence of healers also structures the environment. Patients are not left entirely alone. Routines are established, and information about symptoms, recovery, and decline circulates. You notice that even flawed or incomplete interventions foster resilience, helping communities endure despite overwhelming risk. Historians still debate how much actual medical efficacy existed, but the social function is undeniable. You follow a barber surgeon moving from home to home, applying his craft to patients too weak to leave. His methods are rudimentary, yet his observations are keen. He notes which cases worsen rapidly, which respond to herbal treatments, and which individuals recover unexpectedly. Families imitate what they see, incorporating these partial lessons into daily survival strategies. Fringe practices remain visible. A child wears an amulet, an elder carries an herb bag, a woman sprinkles scented powders around her home. All are attempts to assert control over a chaotic environment. As evening falls, the city quiets again. Healers retreat to minimal shelter, exhausted but vigilant. Patients wait under watchful eyes, families adapt routines, and the streets themselves seem to pulse with cautious activity. You notice how the interplay of observation, ritual, and adaptation forms an invisible scaffolding for survival. Human ingenuity, even when partial or mistaken, enables coping with an unseen threat. Fear, knowledge, and superstition coexist, each reinforcing the other, guiding behavior, and influencing survival. Even amid uncertainty, the human spirit persists, continually testing boundaries, observing patterns, and creating fragile systems of resilience. You step into a quiet morning, the sun just brushing the rooftops, and notice how homes themselves have transformed into fortresses against the invisible threat lingering outside. Families barricade doors with planks, hang thick cloth over windows, and burn aromatic herbs in fireplaces, believing the smoke purifies the air. You probably wouldn't last a day without adopting some of these measures yourself. Every house becomes a controlled environment, balancing ventilation, warmth, and protection, and small choices, like which rooms to occupy or when to open a window, carry significant weight. Historians still argue whether these domestic adaptations meaningfully reduced disease or simply provided psychological comfort, yet the patterns are consistently observed. Inside one household, you see the meticulous routines: floors swept, refuse burned or buried, bedding boiled or sun-dried, and water carefully stored. Children are restricted to certain rooms, taught early to avoid contact with anyone showing signs of illness. You notice small innovations, ropes strung across doorways for communication, herbs placed in windowsills, and vinegar-soaked rags covering handles and surfaces. Even in the absence of full scientific understanding, observation drives these choices. Families adapt continuously, learning from neighbors, gossip, and trial and error. Fringe practices abound, feathers hung from ceilings to catch the plague, bells rung during movement, and charms tied to beds to ward off sickness. You walk past a neighbor's house where a woman mixes a pungent herbal poultice while a child watches intently. She explains in hushed tones that these herbs will keep bad air away, and everyone touches nothing directly but passes items carefully. This layering of ritual, observation, and protective behavior is emblematic of urban life under plague conditions. Survival is negotiated in everyday choices: how food is stored, how windows are managed, and which streets to traverse. Historians still debate how much these domestic strategies influenced overall mortality, but their psychological and practical effects are undeniable. In courtyards and back alleys, small fires burn herbs like rosemary, sage, and lavender. Smoke curls upward, believed to cleanse the air while masking the stench of refuse and decay. Cats patrol for rodents, and families actively manage the movement of animals to reduce flea exposure. Even subtle actions, closing a secondary door to limit airflow, elevating food barrels, demonstrate an emergent understanding of vectors. You notice how observation becomes a daily ritual. Children learn which areas are unsafe, adults negotiate supply runs cautiously, and everyone contributes to a shared survival strategy. Fringe measures persist alongside practical ones, reflecting both the ingenuity and superstition inherent in human behavior. You peek into a basement where water is stored and notice it carefully covered to prevent contamination. Daily chores have become exercises in risk assessment: laundry handled with care, floors scrubbed, and meals prepared with the awareness that even simple mistakes can invite illness. Families communicate through notes and signals, passing items without direct contact. You notice that the very structure of the home has become part of a survival strategy, and routines adapt around this new spatial awareness. Historians still argue whether these household behaviors genuinely slowed infection, but across many documented outbreaks, they are consistently recorded as integral to coping. Even meals are approached with caution. Ingredients are washed repeatedly, bread is kept elevated, and animals are segregated from living spaces. You observe children taught to avoid close contact with elders who show any sign of weakness, and the subtle hierarchies within households reflect both practical and psychological considerations. Fringe tips are passed along: burning herbs while cooking, placing onions in windows, or sprinkling salt to cleanse the floor. Whether symbolic or practical, these measures provide reassurance and enforce routines that enhance survival in subtle ways. By afternoon, the home has settled into a rhythm of cautious activity. Sweeping, boiling, airing rooms, and observing the behavior of family members all blend into a continuous loop of vigilance. You notice how the home itself becomes a microcosm of society, controlled, patterned, and reactive. Human ingenuity surfaces in small inventions: a pulley to pass supplies through a window, herbs tied to door handles, or partitions created to separate spaces. Each innovation is a response to necessity, blending superstition, observation, and partial knowledge into a survival toolkit. As evening falls, the household quiets. Children settle under blankets in designated rooms, fires flicker low, and aromatic smoke curls toward the ceiling. Even in relative calm, vigilance continues. Doors remain closed, surfaces are wiped, and herbs are refreshed. The home, once merely shelter, has transformed into both a sanctuary and a laboratory of practical experimentation. Fear, observation, and ingenuity coexist, guiding behavior and fostering resilience. You realize that survival is as much about mental fortitude and routine as it is about the physical environment, and these domestic strategies will echo through the rest of the plague experience. The church bell tolls softly in the morning fog, and you walk toward the familiar structure, noting the clusters of people gathering outside. Religious ritual has become central to coping during the plague. You probably wouldn't last long without understanding the rhythms of these spiritual routines. Processions, prayers, and penitential acts fill the day, blending devotion with subtle social organization. Inside, incense hangs thick in the air, candles flicker against stone walls, and congregants whisper prayers for protection, some carrying charms or relics. Historians still argue whether spiritual practices had any measurable effect on survival, but they undeniably influence behavior, offering solace, structure, and a sense of agency amidst chaos. As you wander through the nave, you notice families kneeling, hands clasped tightly, faces pale with fear or fatigue. Priests move among the faithful, sprinkling holy water, reciting prayers, and instructing ritual penances. Processions wind through streets, candles held high, incense burning, a spectacle both solemn and practical. People are reassured by participating, believing in divine intervention, while simultaneously observing each other's compliance with social distance. Fringe beliefs persist. Carrying a relic will ward off disease, wearing a certain color of cloth will protect the wearer, or chanting specific psalms brings luck. While not scientifically grounded, these practices shape behavior and indirectly reduce reckless contact. Outside the church, you notice the interplay of religious ritual and daily survival. Communities organize around faith, establishing informal networks of care. Messages and supplies are exchanged through intermediaries to minimize direct contact, and families take cues from the clergy on which areas are considered safe or dangerous. Observation and adaptation are as crucial as prayer. Avoiding certain neighborhoods, limiting travel, and adhering to ritual routines all serve to enhance survival chances. Historians still debate whether these interventions had any epidemiological effect, but their social and psychological impact is unmistakable. You pause to watch a group of penitents moving slowly through the streets, barefoot and chanting, a spectacle meant to appease divine wrath. Children follow at a distance, learning rituals and observing behavioral cues, while elders maintain an alert eye on disease patterns, instinctively combining superstition with observation. Fringe practices abound, sprinkling salt in intersections, ringing bells to ward off spirits, or hanging charms at doorways. Even in these ritualized acts, you notice practical benefits: less physical contact with neighbors, increased awareness of surroundings, and a structured routine that discourages chaotic movement. Inside homes adjacent to the church, families adopt routines influenced by these religious practices. Prayer times coincide with cleaning rituals, herbs are burned in sync with candle lighting, and doors are barricaded during processions to limit exposure. Children observe patterns and imitate behaviors that balance spiritual reassurance with practical caution. These overlapping strategies create a matrix of survival, where superstition and empiricism coexist. Historians still argue whether spiritual and practical strategies were consciously linked or simply coincidental, yet the patterns repeat across outbreaks, suggesting an emergent understanding of risk management. In the marketplace near the church, merchants observe quiet rituals and adjust interactions. Transactions are brief, goods are handled minimally, and occasional charms are exchanged with purchases. Observation drives behavior. Noticing which practices appear to correlate with health, families and merchants alike adapt quickly. Fringe tactics continue alongside structured religious routines, sprinkling vinegar on surfaces, wearing protective herbs, or tying threads for safety. These acts, often symbolic, reinforce adherence to distance and hygiene, illustrating how ritual can serve both psychological and practical functions. As the day progresses, processions wind through different districts, each neighborhood coordinating with the clergy to minimize overlap and maintain order. You notice that these routines, though spiritually motivated, impose a structure on urban life that reduces random interactions and guides behavior. Observation of others' health and adherence to ritual informs personal decisions about movement and interaction. This blending of superstition, ritual, and emergent hygiene exemplifies the delicate balance between belief and survival. By evening, the church and surrounding streets are quieter. Candles flicker, incense smolders, and families retreat to homes that are themselves fortified microcosms of careful adaptation. Rituals continue indoors. Prayers before meals, herbs burned in corners, and careful observation of symptoms in loved ones. Even as fear persists, religious practice provides comfort, structure, and a subtle form of behavioral control that complements domestic and communal strategies. Survival is woven into daily life, a tapestry of faith, observation, and human ingenuity, shaping both mindset and action in the shadow of plague. You trudge down a narrow alley as the morning mist clings to your cloak, noticing that scarcity has begun to define life in every household. Food, already limited by disrupted trade routes, is now a matter of careful management. You probably wouldn't last a week without learning which stores to visit, how to ration, and which foods are safest to consume. Farmers in surrounding villages struggle to transport produce into the city, while merchants carefully weigh the risks of travel. Historians still argue whether famine or disease contributed more heavily to mortality in certain outbreaks, but the two are clearly intertwined. You observe baskets of vegetables left outside doors for quarantine families, while inside homes, grains and legumes are boiled and stored meticulously to avoid contamination. People wash produce multiple times, store water in sealed containers, and rely on cooking to kill unseen threats. Even minor deviations in handling can mean exposure. Fringe methods persist. Some sprinkle salt around storage areas, hang herbs to deter pests, or apply onion slices to food as a protective charm. These practices mix superstition with partial hygiene, providing reassurance while sometimes offering minor practical benefits. At a market square, you notice a subtle transformation in trade patterns. Merchants handle goods minimally, buyers linger only briefly, and exchanges are often conducted through intermediaries or with items passed on trays to limit direct contact. Bread, meat, and other staples are elevated on platforms or stored in sealed containers. Livestock is penned carefully, away from communal spaces. Even small choices, covering flour sacks, avoiding contact with stray animals, or moving goods quickly, demonstrate an evolving understanding of disease vectors. Historians still debate whether these methods materially reduced contagion, but they certainly influenced daily behavior and survival. You stop by a water well where a family fetches fresh water using a rope pulley. Children are instructed not to touch the handle, and adults wipe it with vinegar before returning the bucket. You realize that every small act, washing hands, boiling water, separating utensils, forms a network of protective measures that cumulatively reduce exposure. Fringe practices are common: burning certain herbs over water, hanging protective charms, or offering small prayers before drawing it. While their effectiveness varies, the repetition and ritualization of behavior subtly reinforce hygiene and vigilance. In nearby alleys, you see how scarcity has shifted communal norms. Households trade essentials, sometimes using barter to avoid excess handling of coins, which are thought to carry disease. Observing neighbors' health informs these exchanges. Goods from healthy households are preferred, while others are shunned. Fear, observation, and practical caution intersect. Fringe habits continue, sprinkling powders on surfaces, carrying protective herbs, and following traditional plague days for shopping to avoid crowded times. These small innovations create a dynamic survival strategy that adapts to risk, scarcity, and communal knowledge. You watch a baker distributing loaves to a quarantined family. The process is deliberate. Items are left outside, coins placed on a tray and wiped, and interaction minimized. Families mimic such careful practices, adjusting routines at home accordingly. Observation and adaptation are critical. Which paths to take, which hands to shake, and how to prepare meals all become vital components of survival. Fringe practices intermingle seamlessly with practical ones, creating layered strategies that combine superstition, hygiene, and psychological comfort. By midday, the city hums with a tense, muted rhythm. Streets are quieter, commerce is slow, and families continue careful routines indoors. Food preservation dominates thought and action. Grain is boiled, meat smoked, and water covered. Observation of neighbors' habits guides personal decisions, while small rituals, burning herbs, sprinkling salt, or tying protective charms, persist. You notice that scarcity, fear, and ingenuity combine, shaping behavior in subtle yet profound ways. Historians still argue how much survival depended on resource management versus avoidance of disease, but the two are undeniably linked. As evening approaches, the city quiets further. Households settle in, preparing meals with extreme caution, storing essentials safely, and reinforcing domestic boundaries. Children follow rules meticulously, adults remain alert, and fringe rituals are refreshed, herbs replaced, charms checked, small fires relit. You realize that in times of scarcity, every action, no matter how small, is magnified in importance. Survival hinges on adaptation, observation, and maintaining both practical and psychological defenses. Even amid fear, communities innovate, cooperate, and preserve fragile systems of safety that sustain them day by day. The morning air is heavy with smoke and damp, and you notice the faint, persistent rustle of rats in the alleyways. Their presence is constant, their movements unpredictable, and yet, humans have adapted in surprisingly sophisticated ways to mitigate the threat they carry. You probably wouldn't last a single day ignoring these small, furry vectors, but observation and careful planning can make all the difference. Fleas, invisible yet lethal, move freely between rats and humans, their role in transmitting plague only partially understood at the time. Historians still argue whether early rodent control efforts had a measurable effect, but the behavioral adaptations they prompted are undeniable. You follow a narrow street where merchants have begun elevating their goods, stacking sacks of flour and grain atop wooden platforms to reduce contact with the floor and wandering animals. Families and shopkeepers alike use cats and dogs strategically to hunt rats, though not all animals are trustworthy. Some households keep ferrets, others rely solely on the cat's instinctive hunting abilities. Fringe methods persist, sprinkling powdered herbs, hanging charms, or using clanging bells to scare rodents away. Even if largely symbolic, these practices integrate with practical measures, shaping routines that enhance survival chances. In the marketplaces, you observe a subtle choreography of caution. Buyers handle produce minimally, sellers step back to maintain distance, and interactions are brief yet deliberate. Coins are sometimes wiped with vinegar or wrapped in cloth, a small but telling gesture of adaptive hygiene. The arrangement of goods and timing of transactions demonstrate a keen awareness of contagion risk, even without understanding the microbial mechanisms at play. Fringe practices abound, sprinkling ash near grain, tying protective herbs around baskets, or chanting brief prayers while handling items. Each practice reflects a blend of observation, superstition, and necessity. You notice children following instructions meticulously, avoiding certain alleys, keeping away from stray animals, and observing hand-washing routines learned from elders. Adults adjust behaviors subtly, learning from the outcomes of previous interactions. If a neighbor falls ill, households nearby modify routines immediately, limiting exposure, rearranging storage, and reinforcing domestic barriers. Historians still debate the degree to which these community adaptations reduce disease transmission, but the consistency of such behaviors across urban centers indicates a widespread understanding that proximity, movement, and cleanliness matter. In one alley, you observe a family using simple partitions to separate storage areas from living spaces. Grain, flour, and water are isolated, bedding elevated, and floors scrubbed repeatedly. Rats, though still present, are largely confined to corners and refuse piles. Fringe interventions continue, burning sage or rosemary, tying red threads around entryways, or placing garlic in windowsills. You notice that these measures, symbolic or not, reinforce attention to detail and structure daily routines in ways that enhance both safety and psychological calm. By afternoon, observation has become almost second nature. You notice which paths to take, which markets are safest, and how to handle goods with minimal contact. Merchants, aware of the heightened vigilance, modify their interactions. Fewer goods are displayed openly, interactions are transactional and brief, and protective rituals persist alongside practical adaptations. Communities begin to function as integrated networks of observation, each household influencing the behaviors of its neighbors. Fringe measures, while superstitious, serve as reminders to maintain caution and structure daily routines. In homes, The influence of rats and fleas is evident in domestic arrangements. Sleeping areas are elevated, floors swept and washed regularly, and animals kept at a distance from living spaces. Children imitate these routines, learning early that survival depends on vigilance, observation, and adherence to household norms. Even seemingly minor acts, closing a door, washing a surface, or passing objects carefully, are crucial components of a broader strategy. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these interventions, but the behavioral patterns are consistent, suggesting an emergent understanding of vectors. As evening falls, the city quiets and shadows lengthen across cobblestone streets. Families retreat indoors, repeating daily routines of cleaning, observation, and protective rituals. Cats patrol corners, herbs smolder in fireplaces, and vigilance continues into the night. You reflect on the delicate balance of survival, attention to rodents, careful handling of goods, and the reinforcement of domestic boundaries all contribute to persistence. Fear, superstition, and ingenuity coexist, guiding behavior in subtle but essential ways. The human capacity to adapt, observe, and integrate practical and symbolic strategies becomes a lifeline, sustaining communities under relentless threat. The day begins with a faint drizzle, the city streets slick and reflective, and you move cautiously among puddles and mud. Water, while essential, has become a vector of anxiety, even if not fully understood as a conduit for disease. You probably wouldn't survive long ignoring the precautions that people now instinctively take: boiling water, storing it carefully, and limiting shared containers. Historians still argue whether waterborne transmission played a significant role in plague outbreaks, but careful handling clearly shapes survival. The routines surrounding water collection and usage are now deeply embedded in daily life. At a communal well, families form orderly lines, keeping distance and observing strict hygiene. Buckets are wiped, hands washed, and items handled minimally. Children watch and mimic these behaviors, internalizing lessons in risk management. You notice subtle patterns. Households that follow rigorous precautions tend to avoid illness longer, while those that shortcut routines often pay the price. Fringe practices coexist alongside practical measures. Herbs burned at the well, charms hung nearby, or brief prayers offered before drawing water. Even if these rituals don't purify the water chemically, they reinforce careful attention and adherence to safety protocols. In narrow alleys, you see families implementing small but effective adaptations. Roof gutters are redirected, refuse managed meticulously, and animals restricted from water storage areas. Every minor choice is magnified in importance. A dropped coin, an unattended bucket, or a misplaced utensil could introduce disease into the home. Observing neighbors' successes and failures informs future behavior, creating an informal knowledge network. Historians still debate how much observation versus superstition actually impacted mortality, but the consistent behavioral changes across regions suggest a significant effect. You move past a baker's stall, where loaves are handled carefully to minimize contact. Flour sacks are elevated, surfaces wiped, and coins exchanged via trays. Merchants and buyers alike are hyper-aware of potential contamination, adjusting movement patterns, transaction methods, and storage practices accordingly. Fringe habits persist, sprinkling aromatic powders, hanging charms, or reciting short prayers over goods. These acts, while symbolic, encourage mindfulness and reinforce routines that reduce unnecessary exposure. Observation, ritual, and practical hygiene form a cohesive survival strategy. Inside homes, water management dominates attention. Containers are sealed, utensils kept separate, and floors regularly washed. Children are assigned small chores that teach vigilance: pouring water carefully, scrubbing surfaces, or observing animal behavior. You notice that repeated practice instills habits critical for survival, embedding both observation and ritual into everyday life. Fringe strategies, placing onions near storage areas, burning specific herbs, or marking safe containers with chalk, intertwine seamlessly with practical methods, illustrating human adaptability. By midday, patterns of behavior have become second nature. Streets hum with cautious activity, families pass by each other without direct contact, merchants handle goods minimally, and children follow learned routines. Observation guides almost every action, and small rituals maintain psychological equilibrium. You note that even when scientific understanding is absent, behavioral strategies, cleaning, separation, and cautious interaction provide tangible benefits. Historians still debate the magnitude of their effectiveness, but the consistency of such practices across urban centers suggests a clear adaptive value. In markets and courtyards, you observe how communities reinforce norms. Messages are left at doors, intermediaries deliver goods, and families communicate indirectly. Observation continues to dominate: which households are healthy, which streets are risky, and which merchants follow safe practices. Fringe customs persist alongside practical measures, blending superstition with observation. Each layer, ritual, behavioral adjustment, and practical intervention, creates a multidimensional defense against the invisible threat. As evening approaches, the city quiets, and the rhythm of vigilance continues indoors. Water is stored carefully, utensils washed repeatedly, and herbs refreshed. Children and adults alike follow routines learned through observation and imitation. Even minor acts, opening a window, boiling a container, or wiping a surface, are imbued with survival significance. Fear, ingenuity, and superstition coexist, guiding behavior and fostering resilience. The delicate balance between psychological comfort and practical action sustains communities, helping them endure yet another day under constant threat. The morning air is crisp, carrying the scent of damp stone and smoldering herbs from countless chimneys. You walk through narrow streets where families have begun to perfect routines born of necessity. You probably wouldn't survive a week without adopting these practices yourself: careful observation of neighbors, cautious handling of goods, and adherence to rituals, both practical and symbolic. Historians still debate which measures were most effective, but it's clear that vigilance, routine, and social learning profoundly shaped survival outcomes. In a sunlit courtyard, a woman scrubs the floors with vinegar and water while children carefully carry buckets of boiled water to different rooms. Animals are restricted from living areas, and bedding is elevated from the ground. Every movement is deliberate. Utensils are kept separate, refuse is collected promptly, and herbs are burned in fireplaces to purify the air. Fringe methods coexist seamlessly: charms hung on doorways, small fires lit in corners, and repeated prayers recited to ward off unseen threats. These acts, while largely symbolic, provide psychological reassurance and encourage strict adherence to daily routines. At a market stall, you notice subtle adjustments in commerce. Bread is elevated on wooden platforms, coins are wrapped or wiped with vinegar, and interactions are minimized. Buyers and sellers alike observe one another's habits, learning through imitation and careful attention. The rhythm of trade is slower, more deliberate, and guided by both fear and observation. Fringe practices persist, sprinkling aromatic powders on goods, tying protective herbs around baskets, or murmuring prayers while handling items. Even when symbolic, these behaviors reinforce attention to hygiene and caution. Inside homes, survival strategies are finely tuned. Meals are prepared with meticulous care, storage areas are segregated, and daily chores follow a precise schedule. Children and adults alike learn routines that limit exposure, passing items carefully, cleaning surfaces regularly, and observing subtle signs of illness in household members. You notice how knowledge flows organically. Neighbors share tips, families imitate effective practices, and small adjustments are integrated into daily life. Historians still debate whether these incremental improvements significantly reduced mortality, but they undoubtedly shaped behavior and reinforced community cohesion. In alleys and side streets, you see improvisation at its most creative. Elevated platforms for food, makeshift barriers to block access to animals, and partitioned living spaces reflect a deepening understanding of risk management. Observation remains central, noting which streets are safe, which households are healthy, and which paths to avoid. Fringe practices continue alongside practical interventions: burning herbs, hanging charms, or sprinkling vinegar on surfaces. These behaviors, a mix of superstition and empiricism, collectively form a survival strategy that extends across neighborhoods and households. By afternoon, the city operates with a delicate rhythm of vigilance. Merchants adjust their timing, households maintain routines, and children follow established patterns. Observation guides behavior, which interactions are safe, how to handle goods, and how to navigate streets efficiently. Fringe rituals persist, creating psychological structure that complements practical hygiene measures. You notice how humans adapt continuously, learning from observation, imitation, and small experiments in daily life. Historians still argue about the exact efficacy of these methods, but their consistency across regions demonstrates the ingenuity of ordinary people. Evening brings a quiet that is almost tangible. Families retreat to their fortified homes, perform final cleaning and protective rituals, and prepare for the night. Cats patrol corners, herbs smolder gently, and children follow established routines. Observation, superstition, and practical knowledge blend seamlessly, creating a web of behaviors designed to reduce risk and instill psychological calm. You realize that survival is an intricate balance. Each act, however small, contributes to a layered strategy of vigilance, adaptation, and resilience. As night falls, you reflect on the city's collective effort, the careful handling of food, water, and goods, the structured domestic routines, the subtle use of superstition, and the constant observation of others. Together, these behaviors sustain life, maintaining both physical safety and psychological reassurance. In this environment, fear becomes a tool for learning, and ingenuity merges with ritual, ensuring that each day survived adds another thread to the delicate tapestry of endurance. The morning fog lingers in the narrow streets, dampening the sounds of the city, and you trudge carefully, noting the subtle rhythms of human adaptation. You probably wouldn't last long without understanding how observation, ritual, and practical measures intersect. Every household, alleyway, and market stall is a microcosm of survival strategies: elevated goods, segregated spaces, ritual herbs, and cautious interactions all work together to reduce risk. Historians still debate which interventions were most effective, but the behavioral consistency across outbreaks is striking, demonstrating a deep, adaptive understanding of urban life under plague. You pass a small apothecary where jars of herbs, powders, and tinctures line the shelves. Patrons handle items cautiously, while the apothecary applies subtle rituals, sprinkling powders, reciting brief prayers, or waving aromatic herbs, to purify spaces and reassure customers. Fringe practices blend with practical observation. Herbs are selected based on prior results, coins wiped or wrapped, and interactions minimized. You notice that even symbolic acts encourage careful behavior, reinforcing vigilance and attention to detail in ways that can subtly reduce risk. In nearby households, routines are precise and deliberate. Floors are scrubbed, utensils separated, and bedding elevated. Children learn by imitation, practicing careful handling of water, food, and tools. Observation guides decisions: which alleys to traverse, which neighbors to avoid, and how to interact safely. Fringe measures remain prominent: charms hung on doors, incense burned in corners, or small fires lit to cleanse the air. Each act, while partially symbolic, instills a sense of control and reinforces adherence to safety protocols. At a market, you notice merchants coordinating subtly to maintain social distancing. Exchanges are quick and deliberate, and products are elevated or wrapped. Buyers observe each other's habits, imitating safe practices and avoiding interactions with potentially risky individuals. Small rituals accompany commerce: herbs sprinkled on counters, brief prayers, or incense used to mask odors. Even without scientific understanding, these actions shape behavior, reduce unnecessary contact, and provide psychological reassurance. Historians still debate the direct impact of such measures, but their prevalence indicates an adaptive value. You wander through a residential alley, noticing ingenious adaptations. Elevated platforms prevent rats from accessing stored food, partitions isolate spaces, and windows are opened strategically for ventilation. Families monitor the behavior of both neighbors and animals, adjusting routines in response to observed patterns of illness or health. Fringe practices coexist with practical interventions, forming a layered system of vigilance: burning herbs, tying protective charms, and observing daily signs of disease. Each measure reinforces the other, creating a dynamic, self-reinforcing survival strategy. By midday, the city hums with a quiet, calculated rhythm. Households continue routines, merchants minimize exposure, and children practice observational learning. Communication relies on indirect exchanges, notes, or messengers to limit risk. Observation, ritual, and adaptation create an intricate web of behaviors that guide movement, interaction, and care. Even minor deviations are noted and corrected, reflecting a collective understanding of risk and survival. Historians still debate efficacy, but the behavioral patterns are clear and consistent. As evening approaches, streets empty and households retreat indoors. Cats patrol corners, herbs smolder in fireplaces, and doors are reinforced. Families continue domestic routines, observe symptoms, and perform protective rituals. Observation and imitation shape behavior across generations, teaching children how to navigate risk and maintain daily survival. The city operates as a network of layered defenses, combining superstition, vigilance, and practical knowledge. Fear, observation, and ingenuity coexist, ensuring that daily life persists despite the ever-present threat of plague. The morning sun filters through a hazy sky, casting muted light over streets slick from overnight rain. You move cautiously, aware that survival now depends on attention to the smallest details. You probably wouldn't last a day without learning which streets to avoid, how to handle goods, and how to navigate social interactions with care. Observation is constant, noting symptoms in neighbors, tracking patterns of illness, and adjusting routines based on emerging knowledge. Historians still argue about which behaviors were truly effective, but the consistent patterns across outbreaks reveal a profound adaptive intelligence in ordinary urban populations. In homes, routines continue with quiet precision. Floors are scrubbed repeatedly, bedding elevated, and animals confined to designated areas. Children perform chores under careful supervision, learning to carry water, prepare food, and handle objects without risking contamination. Fringe practices remain prevalent, burning herbs, sprinkling powders, hanging charms, or reciting brief prayers at intervals. Even when symbolic, these measures enforce diligence and structure daily life, subtly reinforcing protective behavior alongside practical hygiene. You observe a market in mid-morning. Merchants handle goods minimally, buyers step back to maintain distance, and exchanges are carefully choreographed. Coins are wiped, goods are wrapped or elevated, and interactions are brief but deliberate. Observation guides behavior, noticing which stalls appear safe, which merchants maintain precautions, and how items are handled. Fringe rituals persist, blending with practical measures, herbs sprinkled on counters, charms tucked into baskets, or incense used to purify the air. These small acts maintain both psychological reassurance and structured, cautious behavior. Inside streets, families have innovated further. Elevated platforms, partitioned rooms, and carefully managed ventilation demonstrate emergent strategies for reducing risk. Observation drives continuous refinement. Households adjust layouts based on neighbors' experiences, replicate successful practices, and discard ineffective routines. Children absorb these lessons intuitively, practicing careful handling, cleaning, and observation. Fringe rituals, though partly superstitious, complement practical adaptations, creating a layered survival strategy that spans both domestic and public life. By afternoon, the city hums with a quiet, deliberate rhythm. Streets are quieter, exchanges are carefully controlled, and households maintain meticulous routines. Observation, imitation, and adaptation dominate daily life. You notice that communities function as networks of mutual vigilance. Information about illness, risky streets, and safe practices spreads quickly, and behavioral norms are enforced subtly through social observation. Historians still debate the measurable impact, but the influence on daily behavior is undeniable. As evening approaches, households settle into structured routines. Floors are scrubbed, water is boiled, herbs refreshed, and protective rituals performed. Children observe carefully, practicing tasks learned through imitation. Cats patrol corners, small fires smolder, and doors are reinforced. Observation, superstition, and practical knowledge blend into a cohesive framework, sustaining life and instilling psychological calm. The city's rhythm is one of careful vigilance, continual adaptation, and layered defense against the unseen threat. Night falls with a hush over the streets. Families retreat indoors, repeating routines of observation, cleaning, and ritual. Even minor actions, careful handling of utensils, attention to airflow, or placement of herbs, carry significance. The blending of fear, observation, and ingenuity forms the backbone of survival. Each measured action reinforces the others, creating a web of protection that spans households and neighborhoods. Life persists through routine, vigilance, and the human capacity to adapt in the face of relentless threat. The final morning rises with a soft, golden haze, and you wander through the city streets, now familiar in their cautious rhythm. Every alleyway, marketplace, and home bears the marks of adaptation and resilience. You probably wouldn't survive long without internalizing the countless routines, rituals, and observations that govern daily life. Observation has become instinctive, noting subtle changes in neighbors' health, recognizing safe paths, and adjusting behaviors constantly. Historians still debate the effectiveness of specific practices, but the collective ingenuity, vigilance, and adaptation of urban communities are undeniable. Inside homes, the routines continue with meticulous care. Floors are scrubbed, water is boiled, bedding is elevated, and animals remain confined to safe zones. Children follow instructions, performing chores with precision, while adults monitor hygiene and environmental conditions. Fringe practices, burning herbs, hanging charms, sprinkling powders, reciting prayers, persist alongside practical measures. Even when symbolic, these acts structure daily life and reinforce attention to detail, creating a subtle but consistent framework of protection. At market stalls, merchants handle goods with practiced caution. Coins are wrapped, bread elevated, and interactions brief. Observation dominates behavior. Buyers learn which stalls follow precautions, which merchants are healthy, and how goods are handled safely. Fringe rituals remain common. Incense, herbs, and charms are integrated seamlessly into daily commerce, reinforcing attention and cautious behavior. Communities function as dynamic networks of observation, adapting rapidly to changing circumstances. In side streets and courtyards, ingenious adaptations abound. Elevated platforms, partitioned rooms, and carefully managed airflow reflect an evolving understanding of risk. Observation guides constant refinement. Households adjust layouts, replicate successful practices, and discard ineffective ones. Children internalize these behaviors, learning the essentials of survival through careful imitation. Even fringe rituals contribute, providing psychological reassurance and reinforcing adherence to cautious routines. As the afternoon sun dips low, the city moves in a quiet, deliberate rhythm. Families maintain routines, merchants limit exposure, and children continue their lessons in vigilance. Information about illness, safe streets, and successful practices spreads organically, creating a network of behavioral norms. Observation, superstition, and practical knowledge intersect, shaping daily life in ways that sustain both physical safety and psychological calm. Evening descends, bringing a soft hush over the streets. Households perform final cleaning, refresh protective rituals, and reinforce domestic boundaries. Cats patrol corners, herbs smolder, and children follow established routines. Observation, ingenuity, and superstition coexist, forming a layered defense against unseen threats. Life continues in careful rhythm. Each small action, each learned behavior, and each symbolic gesture contributes to a delicate framework of survival. As night falls, you reflect on the human capacity to adapt under relentless threat. From domestic ingenuity to public caution, from fringe rituals to practical observation, every behavior intertwines to create resilience. Fear drives vigilance, superstition provides comfort, and ingenuity fosters innovation. Communities endure, learning continuously, adjusting routines, and teaching each generation to navigate danger with care. Even in the darkest times, life persists through observation, adaptation, and the subtle interplay of belief and action. The morning light stretches over the rolling hills, casting long shadows across dirt paths and thatched rooftops. You trudge carefully along the uneven roads, noticing the subtle differences between village life and the bustling cities you've wandered through. Here, space is abundant, the air feels cleaner, and the rhythm of life is slower, but the plague does not discriminate. You probably wouldn't survive long without learning the local strategies for coping, observing symptoms, rationing resources, and improvising protection with whatever is at hand. Even though historians still debate whether rural isolation significantly slowed the disease, the human response, the blend of ingenuity, ritual, and observation, is every bit as compelling as it is in cities. Walking through the village, you notice that households have transformed in response to the threat. Animals are kept separate from living spaces, chickens are penned at a distance, goats tethered to avoid wandering into kitchens, and pigs confined to muddy yards. Water is carefully managed. Wells are covered, containers boiled when possible, and villagers take turns drawing water to reduce contact. Every small action is deliberate, the result of repeated observation and cautious adaptation. Children carry water, help tend small gardens, and assist elders in chores, learning early that careful handling of resources can mean the difference between health and illness. Fringe practices persist alongside practical measures. Bundles of herbs hang over doorways, charms are tied to beds, and whispered prayers are offered to ward off unseen danger. Even if symbolic, these actions structure daily life, guiding behavior and reinforcing vigilance. Inside cottages, the rhythm of survival is subtle but constant. Floors are swept with stiff brooms, bedding is elevated on wooden frames, and food is stored in baskets or barrels off the ground. Cooking is a cautious ritual. Vegetables and grains are washed multiple times, meat boiled thoroughly, and utensils reserved for sick or healthy family members. Observation guides these practices. Households learn from their own experiences as well as the successes and failures of neighbors. If a child develops a fever, the family reacts immediately, isolating the individual, adjusting chores, and alerting close relatives. Patterns of illness are noted and remembered, oral communication carrying these lessons through the village. Historians still debate whether these small interventions materially reduced infection rates, but the behavioral adaptations are indisputable. You wander toward the outskirts of the village, past the small chapel and across fields where farmers tend crops with care. Paths are chosen deliberately, well-trodden routes avoid low-lying areas that may harbor stagnant water, and communal spaces are used sparingly to reduce contact. Trade with neighboring villages is limited. Goods are often left at designated spots for collection, coins wiped or wrapped, and greetings minimized to prevent unnecessary exposure. Fringe rituals accompany these practical measures, sprinkling ash at crossroads, tying protective threads to carts, or offering brief prayers over transported goods. Even if largely symbolic, these rituals reinforce careful behavior, creating a network of precaution that spreads through the community. In the fields, you notice how observation shapes daily life. Farmers keep detailed mental notes of which animals appear healthy, which crops thrive, and which areas of the land seem less risky. Children follow, imitating careful handling of tools and livestock. Livestock is monitored constantly. Sick animals are isolated, pens cleaned, and food and water managed meticulously. Villagers learn from both success and failure, adjusting routines in real time. Fringe practices persist alongside practical adaptations, burning specific herbs to deter insects, sprinkling powders to cleanse soil or storage, and placing charms at entrances to barns. These acts, while partially superstitious, embed discipline, structure, and attention into daily life. Meals in rural villages are approached with deliberate care. Families gather only briefly, avoiding unnecessary clustering, while cooking and serving become part of a structured routine. Grain is boiled, vegetables scrubbed, and milk or dairy products handled cautiously. Children and apprentices learn early the significance of careful preparation, which areas to avoid, which tools are clean, and which foods are safe. Observation continues to dominate, noting which family members develop symptoms, how illnesses progress, and which preventive measures seem most effective. These small acts of vigilance, repeated day after day, form the backbone of household survival. Even in leisure moments, vigilance remains present. Villagers avoid crowded gatherings, festivals are cancelled or scaled down, and social interaction is minimized without cutting off essential cooperation. Communication is largely indirect. Messages left at doorways, supplies exchanged through intermediaries, and warnings shared quietly among neighbors. Observation informs action. If one household falls ill, surrounding families take precautions immediately, adjusting routines, rationing food, and monitoring health carefully. Fringe practices, burning herbs in chimneys, sprinkling powders around homes, tying protective threads around beds, continue, blending superstition and practical attention into a continuous, reassuring rhythm. By afternoon, the village moves in a quiet, deliberate cadence. Fields are tended, chores performed, and children follow closely, imitating the routines of elders. Observation, repetition, and adaptation dominate daily life. Even minor deviations, forgetting to cover water, leaving doors open to animals, or skipping a ritual, are noted and corrected promptly. Knowledge is transmitted orally, through practice, and through shared stories of survival and failure. In this environment, learning is constant, and each household functions as both observer and teacher, reinforcing collective resilience. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these strategies in terms of mortality, but the behavioral patterns are consistent, highlighting the ingenuity and adaptability of rural communities. As evening descends, fires flicker in hearths and smoke curls lazily into the night sky. Animals settle into pens, children finish their chores and retreat under blankets, and adults perform final routines, checking water, cleaning floors, tending fires, and refreshing herbs or charms. Observation, ritual, and careful attention form a layered defense system that protects both physical health and psychological well-being. Even as fear persists, the community operates with a quiet confidence born from routine, experience, and cooperation. Night in a rural village carries a slow, comforting rhythm. The air is still, the fields silent except for distant animal sounds, and the subtle scent of herbs lingers in every home. You notice how daily vigilance has become second nature, washing, boiling, observing, and repeating. Fringe practices continue, not because they are scientifically proven, but because they create structure, reassurance, and a sense of control in uncertain times. Observation, adaptation, and community cohesion intertwine seamlessly, allowing life to persist in the shadow of plague. You lie down, imagining the village at rest, fires glowing dimly in cottages, animals tucked in pens, herbs smoldering softly, and the quiet hum of families following their learned routines. Even far from city walls, fear, ingenuity, and superstition combine to form a protective rhythm. Life continues through careful attention, repetition, and the subtle weaving together of observation and ritual. Here, survival is not just an individual effort but a communal tapestry, each action, each habit, and each small act of care contributing to the fragile, enduring resilience of rural life under the ever-present shadow of plague. Morning light filters softly through the wooden shutters, and you notice a small child crouched near the hearth, hands folded over a bowl of porridge. You probably wouldn't survive long in these times without understanding that the young, the elderly, and other vulnerable members of society face risks that differ from everyone else. Their bodies, immune systems, and social roles expose them uniquely to disease. Observation, careful routines, and layered protection are not merely helpful here, they are essential. Historians still debate the degree to which age and social status dictated outcomes during plagues, but surviving the day is a matter of strategy, vigilance, and constant adaptation. You wander through a village or town and notice the subtleties of care that emerge around children. Parents monitor interactions carefully, keeping infants away from sick neighbors, limiting exposure to crowded areas, and enforcing cleanliness in simple but crucial ways. Food preparation is meticulous. Porridge is boiled thoroughly, utensils reserved for specific children, and storage is elevated to prevent contamination. Even simple routines, like washing hands after touching a door handle or an animal, carry heightened importance. Fringe practices also arise. hanging charms over cradles, burning herbs nearby, or whispering protective prayers. While largely symbolic, these practices reinforce vigilance, embedding habits that improve physical safety without the child even realizing it. The elderly face parallel but distinct challenges. Frailty, weaker immune systems, and limited mobility make avoidance of contact critical. Families restructure homes to reduce exposure, beds are relocated, chairs and tables positioned to maintain distance, and meals delivered carefully. Observation dominates behavior. Neighbors note subtle signs of weakness or fever, and communities develop informal monitoring systems. Children are taught early to avoid certain rooms, elders' movements are watched closely, and chores are adjusted to limit unnecessary risk. Historians still argue about the role of isolation versus practical care and outcomes, but these adaptive behaviors appear consistently across documented outbreaks. Marginalized groups, laborers, itinerants, and the impoverished face compounded vulnerabilities. You notice how access to safe water, food, and shelter varies dramatically, forcing these populations to improvise continuously. Survival strategies differ. Temporary shelters are reinforced, shared tools cleaned carefully, and routines adjusted to reduce exposure. Fringe practices abound, blending superstition with practical measures, sprinkling powders over bedding, tying protective threads to belongings, or reciting prayers before interacting with others. Even in the absence of abundant resources, observation and improvisation allow these groups to navigate risk, though often with more difficulty than wealthier families. Children often serve as both observers and participants in household routines. From a young age, they learn the importance of careful handling of food, water, and objects. They practice small chores, carrying water, cleaning surfaces, tending small animals, while adults monitor their exposure. Observation is constant. If a sibling falls ill, routines shift immediately. Tasks are reassigned, meals prepared separately, and play areas restricted. Fringe methods, placing protective charms, burning herbs, or reciting prayers over toys, reinforce caution while providing comfort and a sense of control for the youngest members of the household. Elderly members often occupy central but vulnerable roles. They are respected and cared for, yet the very deference that protects them can also increase exposure if caretakers fall ill. Observation and adaptation dominate daily life. Caregivers adjust routines, monitor diet and hydration, and isolate elders when necessary. Even minor acts, washing hands before touching a sick family member, using separate utensils, or elevating bedding, carry significant weight. Fringe practices persist, charms hung near beds, protective prayers whispered, and herbs burned to purify the air. These rituals, combined with practical measures, form a layered defense that balances physical and psychological needs. Marginalized populations develop improvisational strategies to cope with compounded risk. You notice how temporary shelters are reinforced with planks or straw, shared water sources boiled or covered, and food rationed with meticulous attention. Observation is critical. Individuals monitor neighbors' health, adjust behavior according to perceived risk, and coordinate survival strategies with others in the same socioeconomic bracket. Fringe measures, burning specific herbs, tying threads to belongings, or following prescribed protective rituals, are as much about structure and reassurance as they are about actual protection. Adaptation is constant, learning from trial and error, observation, and community guidance. Schooling and learning, when it occurs, take on an entirely different rhythm. Lessons are often interrupted or conducted at a distance. Children practice hygiene constantly, and older students may be tasked with observing younger siblings' health. Play is restricted to open spaces, tools and toys are handled with caution, and routines emphasize survival alongside education. Observation is the primary teacher, noting who appears ill, which areas are safe, and which behaviors prevent transmission. Fringe rituals, herbs in playgrounds, charms tied to clothing, prayers before lessons, overlay practical routines with psychological reassurance, helping children feel a sense of control amid uncertainty. V-community care extends across ages and social groups. Neighbors share knowledge of symptoms, advise on routines, and warn of risk areas. Observation of illness patterns informs behavior. If one household reports fever, nearby families adjust chores, movement, and social interaction accordingly. The vulnerable are monitored constantly. Children, elders, and marginalized individuals benefit from layers of vigilance that the healthy adults provide. Fringe practices reinforce attention and adherence to these protocols, combining superstition and habit to support physical safety. By afternoon, routines for the vulnerable are deeply embedded. Meals are delivered separately, water drawn cautiously, and interactions minimized. Children mimic adult habits instinctively, elders follow protective measures, and marginalized groups improvise creatively to reduce exposure. Observation, repetition, and adaptation dominate life. Each act reinforces the next, forming a web of behavioral strategies that sustains survival. Historians still debate exact efficacy, but patterns are clear, showing remarkable resilience across vulnerable populations. Evening arrives, and the vulnerable settle into the relative safety of structured routines. Children sleep in elevated beds, blankets tucked securely around them. Elders recline in chairs positioned carefully within their rooms. Marginalized families reinforce temporary shelters and tidy essentials for the night. Fires flicker low, smoke curls, and the rituals, herbs burning, charms refreshed, prayers murmured, create a comforting rhythm. Observation, vigilance, and care intertwine, forming a layered system that protects both body and mind. Night falls softly, and the vulnerable are shielded by the persistent routines of survival. Children rest under watchful eyes, elders sleep with measured care, and marginalized populations rely on the improvisational networks they have cultivated. Each act, practical, ritualistic, or observational, contributes to a broader framework of resilience. Fear, adaptation, and ingenuity coexist, guiding every choice, shaping every movement, and sustaining life. In these small, deliberate rhythms, even the most vulnerable find a path to endurance. The sun rises over city walls, casting a muted glow on streets still scarred by the memory of illness. You walk cautiously, noting how households and communities have developed strategies to limit exposure. You probably wouldn't survive without observing how quarantine and isolation were implemented, both in formal settings and informally at home. Historians still debate how effective these measures were in controlling plague outbreaks, but the behavioral and psychological impacts on communities are unmistakable, shaping survival strategies and daily life alike. In cities, isolation often begins with homes. Families recognize the first signs of fever or fatigue and immediately separate the affected individual. Rooms are cordoned off, meals delivered without direct contact, and utensils designated specifically for the sick. Observation guides these routines, which symptoms are early warnings, how illness progresses, and which interactions must be limited. Children, elders, and vulnerable members are protected through careful structuring of space, with caretakers maintaining distance, using barriers, or employing rudimentary protective clothing. Fringe practices emerge alongside practical measures, sprinkling herbs at thresholds, hanging charms near beds, or reciting short prayers before entering a room, all designed to provide a sense of control and reassurance. Quarantine extends beyond individual households. Entire streets or neighborhoods are sometimes sealed, with gates or watchmen preventing unnecessary movement. Merchants and travelers arriving from other towns are observed for signs of illness, and their belongings handled with extreme care. Coins may be wiped or wrapped, goods left untouched for days, and interactions limited to essentials. You notice that communities develop informal monitoring systems. Neighbors report symptoms, coordinate food delivery, and enforce separation protocols, creating a layered social network of vigilance. Historians still debate the extent to which citywide quarantines reduce transmission, but the consistent behavioral patterns suggest significant adaptive learning. Isolation is not only physical but also social. Markets are rearranged, gathering times staggered, and schools or meeting spaces temporarily closed. You notice children learning new routines, maintaining distance while playing, washing hands frequently, and observing elders' careful movements. Adults monitor interactions meticulously, limiting direct contact to essentials and ensuring that information about sickness spreads quickly. Fringe rituals persist, herbs burned to purify air, protective charms placed in common areas, and prayers recited for safe passage of goods or people. These practices, while symbolic, reinforce attention and care, embedding protective behavior into daily routines. In rural villages, quarantine is often improvised but no less systematic. Families recognize illness and immediately create separate spaces within cottages or barns. Animals may be relocated, food prepared and delivered with care, and communal resources handled cautiously. Observation is constant. Neighbors watch each other for early signs, adjust routines accordingly, and communicate indirectly to reduce risk. Fringe measures blend with practical solutions. Herbs hung around the village perimeter, protective charms tied to doors or possessions, and small ritual fires burned in open spaces. These acts serve both psychological comfort and practical reinforcement of careful behavior. Isolation strategies also extend to travel. Messengers and traders implement temporary quarantines, leaving goods in designated, safe areas before exchange. Routes are chosen to minimize contact, and coins are sometimes disinfected or wrapped. Children and apprentices observing these procedures learn the importance of caution and structured routines. Communities create signals, flags, notes, or markers to indicate which households are under quarantine, guiding behavior and preventing accidental exposure. Historians still argue about the degree to which such travel-related measures contained outbreaks, but their widespread use shows adaptive understanding of risk management. Food preparation, water access, and sanitation are deeply influenced by isolation practices. Meals are delivered carefully, containers handled minimally, and utensils segregated. Water is boiled when possible, storage containers kept separate, and refuse managed to prevent accidental contact. Children mimic these habits, performing small tasks while observing adults, learning the routines that support survival. Fringe rituals, burning aromatic herbs, placing charms on containers, or reciting prayers, reinforce these practical measures, creating a structured, reassuring environment for those in quarantine. Psychological adaptation is also crucial. Isolation can be lonely, frightening, and stressful, especially for the vulnerable. Communities employ subtle methods to maintain morale: messages left at doors, small gifts of food or herbs, and safe observation of neighbors from a distance. Children are taught new routines of play and study, elders receive care through indirect observation, and communal rituals are adjusted to allow participation without physical contact. Observation, imitation, and structured routines provide comfort and maintain social cohesion while minimizing risk. Evening descends, and households settle into routines that balance isolation with sustenance. Meals are prepared with care, floors swept, animals managed carefully, and herbs burned to maintain a sense of cleanliness and protection. Children observe and imitate, learning early the habits that keep households safe. Fringe practices continue. Charms are refreshed, small fires lit, and prayers whispered at intervals, reinforcing vigilance. Observation remains central, guiding each choice and movement, ensuring that survival depends not only on separation but also on careful, structured behavior. By nightfall, the city or village has adapted fully to the rhythms of quarantine. Households operate in layered networks of care: observation, practical hygiene, restricted movement, and ritual reinforcement combine to protect both body and mind. You notice how daily life continues despite isolation. Chores, study, food preparation, and domestic routines all persist, guided by vigilance and structured repetition. Even in the absence of complete scientific understanding, communities develop effective behavioral strategies that sustain life. Fear, ingenuity, and observation coexist seamlessly, providing a framework of resilience that carries people through both day and night. The quiet hum of nighttime life in quarantine is subtle but profound. Fires flicker in hearths, herbs smolder gently, and families follow routines learned through repeated observation and necessity. Children sleep safely, elders are monitored, and marginalized individuals adapt creatively within these structures. Each act, practical, ritualistic, or observational, adds a thread to a protective web. You feel the rhythm of survival in every gesture. washing, boiling, observing, distancing, and repeating. Fear has become a teacher, superstition a structure, and vigilance a lifeline. Life endures through these meticulous practices, and even under the shadow of plague, communities find continuity, care, and resilience in isolation. The sun rises with a pale, hesitant glow, illuminating streets where shadows of past illness still linger. You walk carefully, observing the movements of those who carry both hope and fear, the medical practitioners, barber surgeons, apothecaries, and folk healers who navigate the delicate balance between care and contagion. You probably wouldn't survive without recognizing how crucial these figures were, both for their practical knowledge and the psychological reassurance they provided. Historians still debate the efficacy of various treatments, but the influence of these practitioners on daily life, routines, and community behavior is unmistakable. In the city, physicians are a rare but vital presence. They move cautiously, carrying small pouches of herbs, powders, and rudimentary instruments. Observation guides their every action, assessing symptoms, noting patterns of illness across households, and advising families on isolation and treatment. The wealthy often seek their services, paying for detailed consultations, while poorer residents rely on folk remedies or local knowledge. Fringe methods, bloodletting, fumigation, or talismans often accompany treatments, blending superstition with the limited medical understanding of the era. Even if efficacy is debated, these practices create structure and guidance, reducing panic and providing a framework for households to follow. Barber surgeons and apothecaries are more visible in marketplaces and alleys. You notice them handling herbs, preparing poultices, and offering advice on preventative measures. Their work relies on observation, which patients show early signs, which treatments appear to ease suffering, and which approaches may inadvertently worsen conditions. Children observe with curiosity, adults with cautious trust, and communities adopt routines suggested by these figures. Fringe practices, such as fumigating streets, placing charms on doors, or performing symbolic cleansing rituals, complement practical guidance, reinforcing patterns of vigilance and structured care. Historians still debate the impact of these interventions, but the behavioral adaptations they prompted are clear. Folk healers, often women or local elders, operate in the spaces between formal medicine and domestic practice. Their knowledge is rooted in herbs, observation, and community experience. You notice how they instruct families on boiling water, preparing herbal remedies, and adjusting routines to minimize exposure. Children assist, elders follow advice cautiously, and marginalized households rely heavily on these accessible guides. Fringe methods, amulets, charms, prayers, and incense blend with practical advice, reinforcing habits and providing comfort in the face of uncertainty. Observation of symptom progression informs the healer's recommendations, creating a dynamic, adaptive system of care. In homes, households follow detailed instructions from both formal and informal practitioners. Meals are prepared with attention to hygiene, water handled carefully, and sick members isolated. Children mimic protective routines, elders adhere to guidance, and households monitor each other for early signs of illness. Fringe practices continue, burning herbs, tying charms near beds, and reciting protective prayers. Even when symbolic, these acts reinforce attention to detail, encourage careful handling of goods, and structure daily life in ways that enhance survival. Medical practitioners also influence community-wide behavior. Notices or verbal warnings spread information about outbreaks, risky areas, and best practices. Observation dominates. Households learn which treatments appear to work, which behaviors reduce exposure, and how to adjust daily routines. Fringe rituals, herbs burned in streets, prayers recited in communal spaces, protective charms displayed, overlay practical measures, providing reassurance and reinforcing vigilance. Communities adapt, imitating successful practices, avoiding high-risk areas, and integrating advice from multiple sources into layered survival strategies. Children often act as both learners and participants in medical routines. They carry water, assist with herbal preparations, and observe the treatment of sick relatives. These activities teach early lessons in careful handling, observation, and ritual. The young internalize protective habits, imitating the behaviors of both practitioners and elders, and participate in symbolic acts such as placing charms or observing cleansing rituals. Observation and repetition embed these practices, creating patterns that enhance safety and psychological reassurance over time. Elderly and vulnerable populations also benefit from guidance. Practitioners monitor symptoms, provide advice for isolation, and adjust care based on individual needs. Care routines are precise, meals prepared separately, bedding managed carefully, and movement within the home restricted. Fringe practices, herbs, charms, prayers, complement practical care, creating a layered system of protection. Even marginalized groups, often lacking access to formal medicine, adopt these strategies via folk healers or community observation, adapting guidance to local resources. Markets, streets, and communal spaces reflect the influence of medical practitioners. Merchants handle goods carefully, avoid direct contact, and implement hygiene routines suggested by both formal and folk healers. Fringe measures remain: incense burned near entrances, herbs placed on counters, protective charms displayed. Observation guides behavior. Individuals learn which merchants maintain precautions, which areas are risky, and how to navigate public spaces safely. Communities develop networks of vigilance, blending superstition, observation, and practical measures into an adaptive system of survival. By late afternoon, the rhythm of care permeates daily life. Households follow routines informed by observation, imitation, and guidance from both formal and folk practitioners. Children, elders, and marginalized members all participate in or benefit from structured habits. Fringe practices overlay practical measures, ensuring attention, discipline, and psychological reassurance. The behavioral patterns are consistent: careful handling of food and water, isolation of the sick, and observant participation in protective routines form a resilient framework. Historians still debate efficacy, but the human ingenuity displayed in these practices is undeniable. Evening descends, and households settle into routines informed by practitioners. Meals are prepared, water stored carefully, animals managed, and herbs burned gently in hearths. Children observe, elders comply with guidance, and marginalized groups adapt strategies creatively. Observation, repetition, and structured practice dominate, creating a web of care that sustains both physical and mental well-being. Fringe practices reinforce attention and structure, blending superstition with practical knowledge to maintain calm and continuity. Night falls with a gentle hush. Fires flicker, smoke curls softly, and the routines suggested by medical practitioners, formal or folk, guide each household. Children sleep safely, elders rest under watchful care, and marginalized families continue improvised protective measures. Every small act, cleaning, observing, isolating, ritualizing, contributes to a layered framework of survival. Fear, ingenuity, and observation coexist, ensuring that even under the constant threat of plague, communities endure, adapt, and maintain the quiet rhythm of life. The morning sun rises over spired rooftops, casting long shadows across streets still scarred by the weight of recent illness. You move carefully, observing the ways communities navigate fear, uncertainty, and survival. You probably wouldn't last long without understanding how social and religious responses shaped daily life. Festivals are canceled, processions modified, and prayers adapted to reduce exposure. Historians still debate the efficacy of these collective practices in controlling plague, but their influence on behavior, routines, and psychological resilience is undeniable. Religious institutions serve both as guidance and as framework for community structure. Churches and chapels are focal points, but gatherings are restricted or altered. You notice priests and monks adjusting practices, blessing goods from a distance, reciting prayers in small groups, and advising families on isolation and hygiene. Observation is constant: which households follow precautions, which streets are crowded, and which communal spaces remain safe. Fringe practices flourish alongside practical measures: holy water sprinkled on thresholds, protective charms placed in homes, and symbolic rituals performed to ward off disease. Even if the spiritual efficacy is debated, These acts reinforce careful behavior and provide a comforting structure in the midst of chaos. Processions and public rituals are restructured. Pilgrimages may be limited to small groups, saints' days observed in private, and large gatherings replaced with individual acts of devotion. Children observe elders conducting prayers, lighting candles, or sprinkling herbs in symbolic acts of protection. Elders instruct younger community members on proper observance, combining ritual with subtle practical guidance, maintaining distance, handling objects cautiously, and avoiding areas where illness is reported. Marginalized groups adopt scaled-down or modified practices, blending superstition with adaptive strategies to remain part of communal life without undue risk. Historians still debate whether religious adaptations directly impacted mortality, but they clearly shape behavior and social cohesion. Community support networks emerge alongside religious guidance. You notice households exchanging goods cautiously, food, water, and herbs passed along at designated spots to minimize contact. Observation governs all interactions, noting which families appear healthy, which streets are safer, and which resources require extra caution. Fringe measures, such as burning incense in alleys, tying charms to public posts, or reciting protective prayers aloud, overlay practical practices, creating a structured rhythm of vigilance and reassurance. Children participate, imitating routines, carrying small offerings, or assisting in safe exchanges, learning early the integration of ritual and practicality. Charitable acts take on new forms. Clergy, wealthy merchants, and community leaders organize food distribution, water collection, and care for the sick, all while maintaining careful hygiene and minimizing exposure. Observation informs these practices. Routes are chosen for safety, gatherings minimized, and vulnerable populations prioritized. Fringe rituals accompany these efforts: prayers offered during distribution, charms placed on food baskets, and symbolic cleansing of utensils. Communities develop resilience through structured support, blending spiritual reassurance with practical mitigation. Social responses adapt subtly to maintain order and morale. Schools may be temporarily closed or classes staggered to reduce exposure, marketplaces reorganized, and communal spaces monitored carefully. Observation dominates daily life: which areas are crowded, which individuals show signs of illness, and how routines must be adjusted. Children learn to navigate these changes, imitating adults in cautious behavior and participating in symbolic acts of protection. Elders provide guidance, reinforcing routines and supervising practical and ritual measures, ensuring continuity of knowledge and safety. Religious festivals and rites are sometimes transformed entirely. Feasts are limited to households, prayers recited at home, and sacred rituals conducted outdoors with physical distance. Observation informs compliance. Families note neighbors' behavior, monitor for symptoms, and adopt or modify practices accordingly. Fringe measures, though symbolic, reinforce these behavioral adaptations: herbs burned to purify air, charms displayed at entrances, and prayers whispered over food or water. These acts integrate superstition with practical care, providing both structure and psychological reassurance. Community-wide vigilance emerges as a layered system. Observation is continuous. Households watch neighbors for signs of illness, adjust routines, and coordinate resources. Religious leaders and elders guide behavior, ensuring that practices align with both spiritual and practical needs. Children participate actively, learning routines and symbolic rituals, and marginalized groups adapt to the modified social structure, often improvising to maintain safety. Fringe practices overlay these adaptations, reinforcing attention, structure, and psychological comfort while maintaining protective behaviors. By late afternoon, the rhythms of social and religious life permeate every household. Meals, chores, and domestic routines follow careful observation and adherence to modified practices. Children continue to imitate adult behaviors, elders monitor compliance, and marginalized populations adapt creatively. Observation, ritual, and practical action blend seamlessly, forming a web of structured survival strategies. Historians still debate the direct impact on mortality, but the behavioral patterns, consistent, structured, and community-focused, are evident. Evening brings quiet reflection. Families observe prayer rituals in private, exchange messages or resources safely, and maintain routines shaped by collective experience. Fires burn softly, herbs smolder in hearths, and charms are refreshed in symbolic acts of protection. Observation guides each movement, avoiding contact where risk is present, managing resources with care, and reinforcing vigilance among children and vulnerable members. Fringe practices overlay practical routines, maintaining psychological reassurance while supporting adaptive behavior. Night falls and social and religious structures sustain a delicate rhythm. Households operate with layered care. Observation, hygiene, isolation, ritual, and structured routine combine to protect body and mind. Children sleep under watchful eyes, elders rest securely, and marginalized groups navigate the night using improvised strategies. Every small act, whether cleaning, observing, or performing symbolic rituals, adds to a network of resilience. Fear, ingenuity, and structured belief coexist, allowing communities to endure and adapt. Even under the shadow of plague, life continues with careful observation, ritualized reassurance, and social cohesion guiding survival through the darkness. Now, the night stretches wide and soft, and you find yourself drifting above the quiet streets and villages you have walked with your imagination. Fires flicker gently in hearths, smoke curling lazily into the cool air, carrying the faint scent of herbs burned for protection and comfort. Children sleep under blankets tucked tightly around them, elders rest in carefully arranged chairs or beds, and the hum of vigilance that sustained the day fades into a gentle, reassuring rhythm. You probably wouldn't survive long in these times without noticing how observation, careful routines, and small acts of care wove together to preserve life. Even in the darkest alleys, the smallest cottages, and the most remote fields, humans adapted. You can imagine families watching over each other, balancing fear with ingenuity, repeating rituals both practical and symbolic. Coins were wiped, food boiled, water guarded, herbs burned, charms placed, prayers whispered, acts that might seem quaint or superstitious now, but which shaped each day, guiding movement, structuring habits, and instilling a quiet sense of control. Observation and adaptation became second nature, and communities thrived in ways both subtle and profound. Historians still debate the effectiveness of specific measures, but the persistence, resilience, and ingenuity of people are undeniable. The night deepens, and the world grows softer around you. You hear only the faint rustle of animals, the distant whisper of wind, and the gentle crackle of dying fires. Every action you've observed, children learning by imitation, elders adjusting routines, marginalized groups improvising carefully, households layering protection, healers guiding the wary, forms a tapestry of survival, interwoven with both caution and comfort. Fear was met with ritual, observation, and creativity, uncertainty countered by care, cooperation, and human resilience. Close your eyes, feel the rhythm of life continuing beneath the night sky, and let the gentle pulse of survival, ingenuity, and quiet vigilance ease your thoughts. Imagine the smoke curling softly, the herbs' scent lingering, the calm reassurance of routines repeated countless times. Even in the shadows, life persists, steady, patient, enduring.